Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Depends on where you're at. My name is Frederick Winsness, and I want to welcome you to another NetHope Solutions Center webinar. And we're proud to start the first of many ICT4D webinars after the ICT4D Conference in Kampala earlier this year. We'll have a follow-on webinars, and we'll start preparing for, I'm sure, the ICT4D conference next year. Today we're going to talk about the takeaways from the 11th ICT4D conference, and this is part one. We're going to do another one next month. We're very pleased to have, of course, CRS, who is the originator of the ICT4D conference, as well as Norwegian Refugee Council, PLAN, and DFID from the UK. So before we get started, I want to go over some housekeeping rules. We want to make this as interactive as possible, so please open the chat window in your WebEx browser. You do that by clicking the third icon from the right, right underneath slides, and you can follow along with the conversation there and place your questions in the chat window, and we will hold the questions to the end of the hour, and Sonia and myself will be facilitating the Q&A session. And we are recording this today, so please look for a follow-up email later on with a link to both the recording and the collateral, and the slides are being presented today. And then we are going to do a couple of polls today. We're going to do a WebEx poll shortly, and at the very end of the webinar, you will be seeing a webinar satisfaction poll, and we certainly would like you to take a couple of minutes to answer those questions so we can improve the series over time. So with that, what I want to do is to switch the slides over to the title slide for our takeaways from the 11th ICT4D conference. And while I turn this over to Sonia, I'm going to open the poll, the first poll, and there are two simple questions. And if you can take the next 3 to 4 minutes, answer those while we're having Sonia introduce the speakers. So what I'll do is to bring us to the speaker slides. So Sonia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Frederick. And thank you very much for NetHope for facilitating that with us. It's always a pleasure to be back. So just, as Frederick said, for the poll, we would like to ask you to what degree do digital tools benefit certain aspects of aid and development programs? So please do choose the option you think is most appropriate for your work or your thoughts. And the second question we have for you is, what is your biggest concern with ICT4D? Please take a moment to fill out this poll in the chat box, and then we will also share the results as well as results with a survey that we introduced briefly. Before we get to all these surveys and polls, I would like to introduce you to our webinar and to our speakers. As Frederick said, this is the part one of our post-conference takeaway webinars. So today we were particularly sharing some insights on digital diversity, humanitarian response, and we also have a guest speaker from DFID talking about the donor expectations. And then in 2 weeks' time, we will have a part two with some of our other consortium partners sharing insights on agriculture, data responsibility, and financial inclusion, as well as supply chain. So we'll share the details for that webinar then. For our part one, I'd like to welcome our expertise. We have Nora Lindstrom. She's the Global Lead of Digital Development at PLAN International. Julio Coppi, the Digital Specialist at the Norwegian Refugee Council. And Heidi Tavakoli, she's a Senior Advisor at Digital Innovation and Capability Department at DFID. So thank you very much for joining us and sharing your expertise from the sessions that you attended at the conference. Before we go to the conference takeaways, I would like to share with you a survey that CRS and DevEx has teamed up to in a second year in a row to ask the development and humanitarian community on the use of ICT4D. Nearly 600 respondents told us the main benefit of using digital tools. And could we go up? Yeah, here's a link we will post it in the chat box in a moment. Could we go 2 slides further? This one, perfect. So again, benefits of so we had nearly 600 respondents, and named timely and higher quality of data, again, as number 1 of the benefits. And while ranked lower, 2/3 believe that technology is saving costs. So do we already have, oh no, we don't have our results yet from our poll because I was really fast. Maybe I'll just go to the next slide, and then we can go back to how our audience here has rated the benefits of this of ICT4D. So the next slide, 47% of the respondents identified Asia as having the most rapid growth in ICT4D, compared to 33% in Africa, and you can also later have a look at the details for other regions. And the next slide, please. And this one is a question about the biggest concerns with ICT4D. So also a question that we asked you, so we can compare our answers. Again, this year, I think there were notable fewer concerns with ICT4D, even within 1 year difference. So particularly concerns around the return of investment have gone down. And let's just have a quick look at our polls here. So we had an answer of 74 participants at this webinar, and the highest concern is the resistance to change, and together with information security. And also similar as in the CRS and DevEx poll, the return of investment was also ranked the lowest in this group, so it's quite representative as well. And then also, as the first question, we asked you, how do you rate as the biggest benefits of the use of digital technologies? As a reminder, the highest one, timely and higher quality data, was number 1. And here our number 1 is actually improved decision making. So that's, I think, a slight difference, but generally, obviously, there's a lot of benefits, and then also cost saving is considered the lowest of the benefits and both of the results. So thank you very much for taking part of this. We will share the results afterwards as well in the post-event email, and you can have a look at the overall survey. So that was just a little bit to get you started, but I don't want to take up any more time from our expertise speakers, and I would like to hand over to Nora, who will be sharing some insights on the digital diversity and key takeaways and lessons learned. Nora, over to you.
Great, thanks, Sonia. So the digital diversity track was a new track at this year's conference, and I had the pleasure of leading that track. And the idea was that we wanted to incorporate particularly questions of gender and disability at the conference, and look at how we as a sector can move towards gender transformative and inclusive digital development. And and what the barriers for this to happen are. So in terms of insights, I actually want to start with a quote by one of the speakers in the track, and unfortunately I never got the person's name. But in any case, he or she said that we need to remember that technology is not the end goal, but rather development is. Now, this should be obvious to us, but it is nevertheless something that we need to remind ourselves of again and again. And this was an issue that was central to the digital diversity track's discussions on inclusion. How do we make sure that our use of technology in development actually promotes development, i.e. it drives equality and inclusion and doesn't further marginalization? Because it doesn't do so automatically. And this is something that Revi Sterling of USAID's Women Connect Challenge very forcefully argued in her session at the conference. She was paraphrasing Conway's law from 1967, pointing out that tech will reinforce existing power imbalances and inequalities unless this is actively mitigated again. So a key message across the track was that unless we design and create for inclusion, and indeed in an inclusive way from the very start, then our digital development programming risks entrenching the unequal status quo and even deepening divides. So in the track session, human or people-centered design, as well as following the principles of digital development, arose very strongly as a trend to improve inclusiveness in digital development programming. This stressed focusing on including users or beneficiaries from the start, which is largely in line with the digital principle of design as a user. But it also stretched to looking inwards, looking at the lack of women in open source communities, for example, as well as in some of our teams, as well as in the teams of who we partner with. And it led to asking questions of whether we can be more intentional in closing digital divides when it comes to who we choose to work and partner with. And also, can we make sure that we're auditing the tools that we use in terms of gender and inclusion before they are deployed? In the track, we also moved away from just looking at technology as a potential enabler of development to looking at questions of societal impact of technology, including the need for digital empowerment and the bridging of digital divides. It was very much recognized that we're doing development in a digital world, and that we need everyone to be included. And one key issue that was discussed in that context was the prevalence of gender-based violence online. Now, while we're working to bridge the digital gender divide in terms of providing access to the internet, it's increasingly clear that regardless of where in the world girls and women live, being female online is increasingly a synonym for being abused online. So while we do want to increase access, we as the international development community also increasingly need to engage with questions of how to make the online world a more equal and inclusive place. And that was perhaps sort of a new discussion or issue at the conference, and that was a really exciting conversation there. And this also linked with questions regarding what's often called sort of ethical AI. Because of the digital gender divide, we know that girls and women in many developing countries have a significantly smaller digital footprint than boys and men do, which means that there's less data about them that can be used in modeling and used in training algorithms, which can lead to biases. And at the same time, we also know that we've never lived in an equal world. The world today isn't equal, which means that most data sets are obviously historical. They're almost by definition biased. Now, the message that came out of the track was nevertheless not that we shouldn't engage in AI and machine learning, but that we really need to do so very critically and with diverse human oversight throughout, which also means that we need to improve diversity among those creating technology, and that's also something that our sector should be engaged in. So I think a clear message was that while there are opportunities to use tech for good, for equality and inclusion, tech isn't neutral. So tech won't create good unless we are very intentional about it doing so. And finally, I'm going to say a word on disability, because this track was intended as a track focused on both issues, on gender and disability. And we did have insightful sessions on disability. But the truth is that we received a lot more submissions on the theme of gender, and gender dominated the track, simply because there were more submissions. But at the same time, the World Bank estimates that 20% of the world's poorest people have some kind of disability. So are we as a sector not really looking at using tech to empower these people? This is something that I was left wondering. So I want to end with a bit of a call to action. Can we explore opportunities to leverage tech in work with people with disabilities and empower them digitally? Is there work out there? And if there is, then maybe at next year's digital diversity track at the conference, we can have more sessions showcasing this type of work, because it's undoubtedly needed. That's all for me.
Oh, thank you very much, Nora. And yeah, very good call for us to work on having a more inclusive program next year. And we will also share with this group once the call for speakers is coming live towards the autumn or fall this year. So our next speaker is Giulio Coppi. He was a co-track lead for the Humanitarian Response track, and would like to share some takeaways and lessons learned. Over to you, Giulio.
Thank you, Sonia. Yes, it was an amazing session, and the track was so hard to keep track of. Sorry for being redundant, but it was very hard to monitor everything, and we had to really jump from one session to the other to make sure not to lose anything. And because the breadth of this humanitarian response and resilience track was so broad, the key topics that emerged are going in a direction that reflects the kind of global discussion that is happening in the sector. The topics that were highlighted through the sessions as the key ones, as the most important, are mostly focused on the way we work, the way humanitarians engage, not with technology, but with users. How do we go away from the idea of beneficiaries? How do we kind of twist the narrative in a way that community engagement is not a one-way narrative, is not a one-way communication exercise, but it becomes like a shared narrative where the local version of what is going on becomes the main voice. And this was highlighted throughout most of the sessions. How do we give credit to the feelings, to the narrative, to the stories of the people that are living the crisis that we are trying to mitigate, whose consequences we're trying to mitigate, and how do we highlight their role, and how do we allow themselves to highlight their own role and their own feelings. So a lot of discussion happened around the tools that can make this happen, social media, online volunteering, online engagement, a lot of discussions around crowd mapping, crowdsourcing of GIS information and collective intelligence, especially with a GIS function, but also citizen-generated data and the role of platforms. which lead us to the second point, which is how can we get as close as possible to real-time analytics level. And this part, a whole set of discussions that are fascinating about how close we want to get to real-time analytics and how close is good enough, knowing that we are not military actors, we are not doing intelligence, we are humanitarian, so we need to take a step back. We don't want to know everything in real time, but maybe near real time is good enough. But what is that near real time that makes the difference between a humanitarian intelligence and military intelligence? How can we harness the power of AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing, all sorts of technologies through this plethora of platforms that are popping up everywhere, and they all offer the same thing, real-time information. How do we go away from this multiplication of tools and we focus on what really has an impact? And how do we enable our colleagues to take decisions that are informed and effective at the same time? And this goes across sector, as it is shown in point number 3, the multi-sectorial coordination of services and digital systems and even access. This is felt as more and more as a priority to solve the waste of several organizations and several actors not coordinating, not sharing, replicating their efforts and depleting local resources. And you know, this kind of gadgety approach of everyone developing his own tool and then everyone tapping into the already scarce local connectivity. How do we enter into a different dimension that brings humanitarian coordination to the next level? And finally, something that is actually a continuation of the discussion that was very strong already in the previous year about ethical data. How do we do our work without doing digital harm? What is this digital harm dimension? What kind of tools and frameworks are out there? A lot of them, handbooks from ICRC, from the Signal handbook, the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative documents and research. There are several of those resources that can be used. And several others have been developed internally by this organization. But how do we frame our intervention in a way that we consider the harm that could come from digital tools? So finally, there were 2 highlights that were not squarely within those takeaways, but they are pretty important to share. And the first is that sometimes paper and digital are pitched against each other, which is totally false statement. It's a false flag. The digital sometimes is how do we make more manageable what is paper-based, what is frugal technology, what is low technology. How do we translate that into something that can be managed, shared, and analyzed easily? And then finally, how do we make sure that whatever we take from the field is still owned by people living in the field? How do we make sure that people are still the owners of the data that involves them, that talks about them, even when we translate it into a cloud-based system? And I think I'm running out of time, so I'll just limit myself here, but there could be so much more.
Thank you very much. Also, please, any participants, if you have questions for Nora or Giulio, please put them in the chat room. We will have some time for Q&A afterwards, so don't be shy. And now I'd like to introduce Heidi. She will share, oh, Heidi, sorry. I didn't check that earlier and I got it wrong. Heidi will join the donor perspective. And Diffit kindly joined a session bringing together donors from various countries and various backgrounds, not just government donors, discussing expectations and also future outlook. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. It's a pleasure to participate in this event today. I thought I'd run through the key discussion points in the session and also some reflections on how donors can be more effective in this space going forward. So first of all, I think there was a good panel for this session. There was representation from GIZ, USA, DFID, Annabelle, the Belgium Development Agency, and the Gates Foundation, as well as the Botner Foundation. During the presentations given by these individuals, it was very positive to hear that there was a clear prioritization of this agenda. That was either prioritized in a specific strategy that emphasized the importance of digital in development. DFID has one, Annabelle has one, and USAID is developing one at the moment. And for the other donors that were participating in the discussion, it was clear that they were prioritizing digital activity in their programs. I also felt that there were some clear common aspects across the different strategic approaches taken by donors. So generally, there was a sense that donors were pursuing an end-to-end approach, and what I mean by that is focusing on not only building internal digital capability, but also looking at how to strengthen digital work in their policy and programming. It was also clear that everyone prioritized an inclusive approach. There was a sense that the community needed to continue to focus on a responsible approach, particularly as it relates to issues around data security that have just been touched on already. And there was an awareness of the importance of building ecosystems in countries to deliver meaningful digital change. I also felt there were some reflections on the different opportunities and challenges around taking both a vertical and horizontal approach to digital programming by donors. I think for some time now, digital activities have been incorporated into sector programs, but there's a sense that the implementation of these programs could be strengthened by encouraging a greater focus on common standards and principles, such as the rollout of the principles for digital development. There was also an acknowledgement that more could be done from a central level and a horizontal approach to encourage the support for what the World Bank calls analog digital complements, to ensure that the necessary regulation is in place in countries, that there is sufficient skills for citizens to participate effectively in a digital world, that there's a strong sort of, digital tech private sector in a country, etc. And there's a role within donors to support these cross-cutting issues. I felt, however, there are three things that the international community and the donors could do more in regard to strengthening digital and tech programming and policy. So first of all, I think there could be more proactive common action across the different donors to build a coalition for change in specific areas. For example, there is a clear prioritization of inclusiveness, and that was touched on by the first presenter, but I think much more needs to be done to identify how are the ways that digital programs can be implemented to ensure that we don't leave certain constituents behind. I also think that we would benefit from hearing from a wider range of donors. It was great that we had some key bilaterals and foundations around the table, but we know that some of the big multilaterals, such as the World Bank and the EU, are currently developing substantive programs in this area, and it would be good to engage them in next year's conference and generally on this agenda. And then finally, I think there is a feeling that both within donors and also the international community, people are really looking for good examples of where programs have worked well and the lessons learnt from those programs should be shared amongst international stakeholders. So, for example, within DFID, we're really keen to identify stories of success that we can actually share with our advisors who are planning digital programs. And I think this is a common feeling across many of the donors, and I anticipate other implementing agencies. So those are my key takeaways from the session.
Thank you very much. Now we have some time for Q&A. So again, feel free to place your questions in the chat. The first question I would like to ask is, the question is, in addition to streamline or limit the number of tools being used in ICT4D, how about coming together around data standards to make sharing data realistic? Do you have thoughts on how to accomplish this? And Nora, I know you are in the group of the digital data principles, so maybe I can ask you to have a go at answering that question.
Sorry, Sonia, was that to me?
Yes, please.
Oh, I'm really not sure. If I had the answer to that, I'd be very, very happy. I'm going to pass the ball on that one, I'm afraid, and hear from I think Giulio.
Would you like to have a go?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yes. So in addition to streamline or limit the number of tools being used in ICT4D, how about coming together around data standards to make sharing data realistic? Do you have any thoughts on how to accomplish this?
Yeah, this is exactly what I was afraid the question was about. Okay, yes. There are standards, Humanitarian Data Exchange, and more broadly, the Humanitarian Data Center that has been established in the Netherlands over the last few years, couple of years now. Last year has been operational. This is the most solid attempt in terms of sharing live data or almost live data that is clean, that has been vetted, that has been organized, and that has been, also visualized. You can go on the website of the HDX. And they developed an amazing set of tools that allow you to visualize your data immediately. You don't even have to do the job of finding a data visualization tool. There is also IADI, which is another standard that is also broadly recognized and that allow you to check the transparency of the operations and their compliance with international standards, and it allows the tracking of programs and projects in the field against the donations that are done. So it's kind of a slightly different perspective, but both options and standards are out there. The problem is more of a upstream kind of challenge. So how do you connect the field tools to these standards or to these organizations or to this platform, knowing that there is a whole organization in between? So ideally, what we are working on as a sector is trying to embrace those standards as a whole so that we adopt them internally, but that takes time.
Thank you very much. Heidi, do you want to add anything to this question or answer?
I would just support what Giulio has said about the types of data sets and standards that are already in place. I think there is a question about whether more can be done to provide guidance to implementing partners on how to manage the data they have on beneficiaries, and that is something that we are examining within DFID at the moment. That's a slightly different issue, I think, from what Giulio was touching on. But I think in the context of issues around data privacy, particularly with increased variety of data on individuals, and that being collected in humanitarian contexts where people are obviously particularly vulnerable, I think it's incredibly important that we continue to ensure that the rights of those individuals are upheld and that data is managed in a very responsible way.
Thank you very much. There was one question to Nora, to your call to action, and it says that the tech sector has been focused on issues of accessibility for those with disabilities in the past, adding new features to products and trying to address them. And the question is, if you see that your call to action to consider these issues gaining traction, and also are we striving to be proactive around issues of accessibility instead of reactive to unintended harm moving forward?
So, I mean, I don't know yet is the answer. This is not directly the area that we were focusing on as plan. We had a partner focusing on disability, but certainly in our own organization, we are increasingly looking at questions of disability, and I would hope, and this is my call to action, is that we would be looking at using digital. There was a session at the conference looking at using data increasingly to understand some of the issues faced by people with disabilities. There was another session looking at providing nutrition guidance to parents of children with disabilities who are often malnourished or have need sort of special diets. So there were some sessions, but they just weren't that many. There was another session highlighting how access is a major issue. Obviously, people with disabilities are often very marginalized. And so the digital disability divide is extremely wide in many places. And another thing that maybe wasn't touched on in the track, but in the context when we're talking about gender-based violence online, harassment and abuse online is obviously not just an issue, a gender-based issue, but it goes for almost any marginalized group. But I would hope that that we would see more, and I think this is hopefully something that we'll see at next year's conference.
Thank you. We also had a question about the ethical data collection. I assume, well, Julia, that was mentioned by you in your presentation, but obviously it is an important topic, and as everybody can sort of chip in if you like. So regarding ethical data collection, do you feel there is sufficient local and field skills around responsible data or overall digital responsibility to address concerns in this area? And if not, what's needed?
Short answer, no. Big no. And it is nobody's fault. Humanitarians tend to be a very resilient beast. They stick to their job because they love it. They have been around, most of them, they've been around for quite some time. They were not required to use data. Most of them do not really know how to define data in the technical way that some other people will actually do today. There are generational issues. There are generational issues, but there are also motivational issues. Some humanitarians joined because they thought of going in context where technology was really not a priority. Well, this is not true anymore. So there is also this kind of pushback from parts of the house in terms of this is not a priority. Why do I need to learn this? Why do I need to learn about what data is, what a data pipeline is, and what data protections, what protections do I need to put in place when I do data collection? So this is an internal fight that we are fighting, and people are open to discussion, but it just adds on their work. So training takes time, training takes people, training takes money and resources that need to be found somewhere. And unfortunately, the calls and support for internal staff training is extremely limited. I would say it's almost zero. So the money to fund the internal capacity that is required is not there. And that basically means that we need to take people out of their job and send them through very long meetings, exhausting meetings and trainings that they don't necessarily see as, the priority. So it just goes on top in theory, but in practice, it just falls behind. And this is something that we see more and more. And people in the field, they really struggle to see why they could put people in danger by collecting data, just because they have not been given the right information and the right amount of tools to see the problem.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Obviously, ethical data collection was also mentioned very much in the donor discussion. So I was wondering, Heidi, if you'd like to maybe add any thoughts to this?
So I think I touched on this in my last answer. And essentially, I do think that this is an important issue that donors are increasingly aware of. At ICT4D, USAID launched their responsible data guidelines, which serve as a very useful example of how donors can apply these processes more effectively. I know GIZ have produced similar documents for their implementing partners. But I agree with what's just been said, that I think much more needs to be done in this space, particularly in the context of organizations collecting much more data and much more sensitive data than they used to, and also there being a recognition that there are issues around data ownership. And in certain countries, there's a strong push from government to own that data and hold that data, and it puts implementing partners in a very difficult situation.
Yes, I agree. Thank you. We have quite a variety of questions. I know we can probably talk about ethical and responsible data for a while, but I just want to also find some other questions to cover. So there's another question for you, Nora. You mentioned that tech, or particularly artificial intelligence, is not gender neutral, particularly in the development space. And what about the technology makes it so hard, and what steps are being taken to improve the neutrality needed to obtain the equality and inclusion that is required? I know that's obviously another one of those big questions, and we won't be able to solve it in a couple of sentences, but would you like to have a go?
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of thoughts on that. I think the idea is that, tech isn't good, it's not bad, but it's also not neutral, and particularly the application or the implementation of technology. So technology itself isn't neutral, but in the application of it, it's also not neutral. And part of the reason is that tech takes on the ideas and the essence of its creators. We all have unconscious biases, and these then become incorporated into technology that gets created. And unfortunately, a lot of technology still today is created by a not particularly diverse group of people. Yet we know that diverse teams come up with better solutions generally with better projects. So just like in development generally, we want to be participatory and inclusive. This needs to go into the creation of technology as well, so that we have different viewpoints at that stage already. Now, in terms of what's being done about it, I think many organizations, including my own, are increasingly looking at training people to design and create their own technology and tools, so digitally empowering them to create and thereby solve their own problems. And I think that's really the key here.
Thank you. I guess we've talked a lot about AI and machine learning. Does any of the other speakers would like to add any thoughts on this?
Sorry, on which regard exactly of machine learning and AI?
Well, so particularly this was about being gender neutral, but I guess just generally about being, I guess, the ethical aspects of AI, really.
Maybe one thing that I was discussing during the strategy session of the International Federation of Red Cross that invited me to provide input is that one of the things that we tend to think the least of is how emerging technologies shape humanitarian action and humanitarian principles. So, for example, a very concrete one. When we talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence, we often think about automation. But what happens in between, it goes back to the concept of data literacy. What happens in between is not clear, and people think it's not their business. Well, the problem is that these kind of technologies, they tend to ingest data, digest data, and then spit out suggestions. Now, what if we go so far from our own analysis that the principles of, for example, impartiality is infringed? So that we start focusing on some population instead of others for reasons that we can't really understand, but it's just the maps that are telling us that we need to focus on that area. Or maybe because our internal software is suggesting that this specific ethnic group is more deserving of aid. And because of the black box effect, we can't just go back and trace our steps to the reasons that give this kind of result. So this is the kind of analysis that needs to be shared and that needs to be embraced by everyone.
Thank you.
So, Nora.
I can just come in on that, and I agree. I think we need to be very aware of the risks around emerging technologies, but I also think they pose huge opportunities for addressing challenges that the international community has found very hard to address before. And I think there are sort of emerging examples of where this is working well. There was a good presentation from Pulse Labs at ICT4D that talked about how they were using AI in a development context, but also doing that responsibly. And they'd worked with the Ugandan government to strengthen its data privacy legal framework to ensure that any applications of AI would be used in an appropriate way. So I think we do need to be aware of the risks, but we also need to make sure we're exploring the opportunities of using these emerging technologies for development.
Nora, you also had some thoughts?
Yeah, so from a slightly different perspective, one issue that was discussed in some of the conversations in the digital diversity track was also, again, more on societal impact of AI, and in particular automation and the impacts on the labor market and on jobs for the future, and that sort of how that can lead to unemployment, and how the lack of digital skills can again, lack of digital skills among young people in particular can mean that they are left outside the labor market or resigned to lower level jobs. So that was also a different sort of element of the whole AI discussion that came up, that I think it's really important that we as a sector engage with, given the huge youth bulge, particularly in Africa, that one of the keynote speakers from the ITU brought up at the conference.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, if I may, just to think, because the point that Heidi made is excellent, and it made me think of a contribution that was very good by one of the participants to the ICT4D, and he said we often focus on the risk of technology, but we never, or almost never, consider the risk of not going digital, the risk of keeping things as they are, the risk that we already impose to the people that we are trying to help by not adopting better systems?
Yes, yeah. I heard a similar quote. I can't actually contribute it to anybody, I'm afraid, but I still like to share it. The question would be keeping the balance of do not harm, do nothing. So that's, I guess, kind of what you just said. We can also not sit here and do nothing or stand still. I also have a question. I know we're still getting a lot of questions in. Some are quite specific on humanitarian tools. So what I might do is share those directly with Julio and also the other humanitarian response track leads, and then we will come up with a summary afterwards. I had a question. And sorry, I'd like to go back to that survey we did. And one new question we asked this year was, who are the principal users of ICT4D tools in your organization's program? And this is obviously not surprising, but I guess just still very concerning that, 62% indicated that their own staff are the largest group, and only 24% stated that the participants or beneficiaries, or even less, 14%, the staff at partner organizations are the largest group of users of their digital tools. So what can we do to shift this? How can we get our partners more involved? How can we help facilitate that localization of ICT4D? Do we have any any thoughts? Do we have any volunteers to share some thoughts?
I'm happy to give a couple of thoughts on that. For one, I mean, and this goes back to what I said earlier in this webinar as well, is that I think we increasingly need to look at digital empowerment. We need to move away from looking at tech as an enabler of development, but ensuring that the people that we work with are digitally literate, digitally skilled, and can use these tools themselves. And so we need to actually have programming targeting that, targeting and digitally empowering people. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think open source tools, so making sure that when we are using a tool or introducing a tool in a project, particularly when we're working with partners, we're ensuring that those partners can then continue using that tool when maybe we're no longer paying for a license to it. So so that we're not creating these sort of barriers that have to do with cost in introducing these tools to partners.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? I guess one of the points was also, sorry, and then I'm done with referring to the survey, was to make easier tools for data collection and analysis. That was always one of the top most powerful enablers for aid and development organizations. So yes, as you said, open source tools, but also just generally make the tools easier to use and not, maybe require too many very specific ICT4D skills. Kind of goes back to the human or people-centered design that we approached a few times during this conversation. I have about 5 minutes left, so what I would like to do is I would like to ask each of the speakers for some sort of final comment, whether it is a call for action or whether it's something you would like to share with the ICT4D community, and then we wrap up and meet again in 2 weeks. So I would just like to, I guess I could just go according to how we started. So sorry, Nora, that means you would go first. I know you already had a call for action to share with us, but is there any other sort of final words you'd like to share with this group?
I think just remembering that we're doing development in a digital world, in a world that's already digital, but where many people, and particularly the poorest and the most marginalized, aren't able to participate. And that's something that we need to change.
Thank you. Julia, do you have any call for action or any conclusions for us?
Yes, summarizing in one sentence all the points and takeaways, I would say that it's absolutely fundamental that we keep pursuing digital tools and technologies for doing greater good, but at the same time we also keep into consideration that the access to these tools is already a sign of kind of benefit on the side of those people that can then access to our services or to the services of the local communities. So we need to consider that we need to track system. We need to be as inclusive as possible, trying to use digital to provide services to those that can access it, but also to free up the amount of forces and resources that can then focus on those that are excluded from the digital landscape.
Thank you. And Heidi, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I would say we should continue to be ambitious as regards this agenda. I think the world will increasingly become more digital and use emerging technologies in more substantive ways. So we really need to look to how we can make sure we leverage these tools in the most effective way to support the development challenges that we now face, but we need to do that in a responsible way and manage many of the emerging risks we're facing around these new technologies.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nora, Julia, and Heidi for sharing your insights and summarizing some of the sessions you attended. And looking forward to work with you again on future events. And we're very excited to also share a summary report of some of the key ideas we discussed. But we also, as we mentioned earlier, will have a part 2 of this webinar, and that will be in 2 weeks, so July the 9th at the same time, starting at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And we will talk about financial inclusion with Michael Dawson from Mercy Corps, supply chain with Jessica Yu from Chemonics, agriculture from Ram from ICRISAT, and responsible data with Ray Short at NetHope. So again, a very interesting speaker panel, and I'm looking forward to meet a lot of the participants. So thank you very much for joining us. And I think we have a survey now to just ask your feedback on this webinar, and if you like also to touch upon any specific topics in our future webinars, we usually run them monthly. Please just get in touch with me directly and let me know what topic you would be interested in, maybe even why or what particular focus around those topics. So thank you all very much for attending, and a big thank you to our speakers. And looking forward to see, hear everybody soon.
Sonia, this is Frederick. There was another quick question for you, and that was whether the recordings, the video recordings from the plenary sessions at the ICT4D Conference was available somewhere, or if they will be available.
They're not yet. We're still looking at some of the files. They were not all in a pristine condition as I hoped, but we're looking to see what we can share. But we definitely have a written summary, and hopefully we'll also have some other digital channels to share.
Okay, when you do, NetHope certainly stands ready to help you distribute that, and so that would be fantastic.
Thank you very much.
I think maybe somebody else came off mute, or the panelists. Any last-minute comments?
I was just going to say thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you very much, Sonia. Thank you for putting on this series. I'm looking forward to the second one. And we're officially out of time, so we'll turn it back over to everybody to get on with their day or their evening. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Good night.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.